Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Family Treehouse, a podcast series brought to you by Storied, where I chat with people that have a passion for genealogy, storytelling, or both. I am your host, Heather Haunert, and today I am very excited to get to chat with our guest, Fiona Brooker, all the way from New Zealand. So I really appreciate her jumping on in such a big difference in time change here to chat with us. Fiona is a professional genealogist, and I absolutely adore her website, which is Memories in Time. She's just got so many amazing things on her site. She's got a project called Memories in Time. We were just chatting all about that before we got on with the podcast today. We're, finding missing items in different places. And sharing those with the world. And then she also has her Modern Family Tree workshop, and she does, and they're actually pictured behind her here in the video. I love how she takes a photo and adds a family tree and uses some color blocking with that. It looks amazing. I could go on and on all day. So welcome, Fiona. I am so glad you're with us today.
Kia ora, Heather.
So excited to chat. So why don't you start today, Fiona? Just tell us a little bit about your background and how you got started in family history and storytelling. And I'd love to hear, I know you have some stuff on your website, but I'd really love to hear any kind of coursework or education that you did, especially since you're part of APG. So that would be awesome to tell us about that.
Sure. So I started family history really young. I remember as a child, we had to do a school project, and I still have the original family tree my mother drew for me. The original letter my grandmother wrote to me telling how my granddad immigrated to New Zealand in the 1920s. Written in child language, so written child friendly as such. I remember sitting on the veranda of my grandparents' home on the West Coast, just outside of Hokitika, where we had received copies of letters from England that our ancestors in New Zealand had written back to their family. And then sort of working with my mum and sitting looking at these letters and working out how they all worked and where they fitted in the family. Got to high school, and the high school had an evening class in family history. And I remember having to go and get special permission from the principal to be able to do an evening class, because obviously I should be doing homework when this evening class was on. And that really started me. And so I've been doing this basically all my life.
Yes.
It was a savior when I was home on maternity leave. My background is actually in accountancy,
Okay.
but it changed over the time. And I guess now I work full-time as a genealogist, doing this every day, combination of research for people, helping them with DNA results, and most importantly, sharing those stories and getting their stories out. But from a training perspective, we have what's called an OE. I don't know if you know what an OE is in US terms.
No.
An OE is an overseas experience. And basically, it seems to be when you get into your 20s in New Zealand and probably Australia as well, we go somewhere.
Love
And
that.
so my husband and I went to England, and we lived in England for 18 months. And while I was over there, I did a whole lot of courses through the Society of Genealogists, but I also did a 40-week night course through the Institute of Heraldic and Genealogical Studies,
Yes.
which is based out of Kent, but the course was in London. And so that allowed me to do some certificates with them while I was there. So that was the first sort of serious qualification. New Zealand had a bit of a qualification. Unfortunately, that folded. I did some teaching on it rather than actually doing it, funnily enough. And then since then, I've done work with Progen. So I did a Progen course, it's always interesting doing courses when you live in New Zealand that are coming out of the States, because we have quite different experiences, both with records,
Sure.
with the type of records that are available and things like that. So I think I learn a lot, but I think I also get the chance to teach a little bit of what's happening in New Zealand at the same time. And then over time, just other courses have come along, and you learn as much as possible. But you have to say that actually going and researching is often where you learn the most, and you find out little things that's like, oh, I didn't know that. That's really interesting to know.
I love that you got that experience in London, in England. That's awesome. And for that long of a period of time, that's phenomenal. So
It was a fantastic course, and it was great to actually get involved and do it. And then you're on site to be able to go and look at so many resources as
yes.
well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
very easy to get distracted.
I think you're right. To be on site anywhere is always such a fun thing. So have you been to the States before to do any kind of research or no?
I've had a weekend in Salt Lake City, or a few days in Salt Lake City, to do research at the family, well, what is now the Family Search Library.
Yes.
But that was on our way home from England, really.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So since then I haven't been back to the States. That's on the to-do list to get back.
Well, if you're going to go anywhere to research, I mean, Salt Lake is the place to go. So that was a good stop.
Absolutely. And my husband got dragged into doing research as well, although I'd probably be happier to be at the basketball stadium instead. But yeah, it was great.
Oh, I hear that. My husband would concur with all of the above. Fiona, tell us, why do you think storytelling is such an important part of family history?
Sure. I think storytelling is the link. We are really good at researching. As family historians, that's what we want to do. We want to trace something, we want to chase it back as far as possible. We want to find all the links, all the documents. But I think it's that next part of, what are you going to do with it?
Right.
Um, a lot, I've been doing this now for 35, 40 years plus. I know a lot of things that I know my family doesn't necessarily know, because it's all in my head, it's all on my computer, it's all in my folders of documents. And so the storytelling part of it is so important, that we actually get out there and share what we know and what we've learned, because we're all going to eventually pass away. And the scariest thing is, it's still locked up in the computer, and no one understands how important it is and what's actually hidden there.
Yeah.
And so that scares me.
Mhm.
And so the idea of getting it out there, whatever format and however it feels comfortable, is really, really important. And so that's been my mission for the last few years, is to get it out of the computer and into people's hands, because it gives them connections. It allows them to understand that maybe something that's happening to us now, we can actually look at what's happening to at what happened to our ancestors, and go, gosh, it wasn't actually that different, or it
Yes.
was quite different. How did they react? What have they had to do? How have they got through? And so that talking and actually recording people's stories is so important. And I know we'll sit around the kitchen table and have a big family dinner with my in-laws, and the stories that start coming out, and you're sitting there going, hang on, just let me turn my phone on so I can
Yeah.
actually start recording this,
Yes.
because we're meant to be eating, but hey, actually, let's record
Yeah.
the story that's just wandering and winding its way out from the conversation around the table.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we definitely all have those experiences. And don't you think that, to the story part of it, for those people that aren't into the records and the dates and numbers and all that, I think that stories speak to them more, and it's not as doesn't seem as sterile. I think that's why stories, people like them.
Absolutely. I remember, when my children were small, I would make up a story about one particular set of ancestors, and sort of make that up as their bedtime story of,
Love
so
that.
Edmund married Anna Maria, and they hopped on a big ship and they came to New Zealand, and they started a farm, and, starting them early. For the children in New Zealand, when they get to a certain year at school, they do some sort of family history project.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if you've had this series of books in the US, but there's a series of books called Horrible Histories. It's a UK based line,
Yeah.
and it takes different periods of time, and as has like the history of that time.
Yes.
And it might be something like the rotten Romans, or the villainous Victorians, or something like that.
Love it.
So my children had these books, and so when they came to doing their school projects with the stories about their own family, it's amazing how the bad stories, or you know, really bad things. So one of their ancestors in Australia was killed by a tree falling on him that he was cutting down.
Oh my gosh.
And, you know, we'd think and go, oh, that's horrible. Whereas the kids are just like, oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Let's, you know, and so I know that my son created a PowerPoint that has the stick figure wandering across and the tree falls down on the stick. Because it's gruesome and, you know, the horrible part of life
Yeah.
when you're a child isn't so horrible, but it's interesting.
Yeah, right.
And even now when I talk about ancestors, oh, is that the guy that got killed by the tree falling on him?
Right. Right. Right.
And so that's what they've hooked things around, is those parts. So it's
Yeah.
interesting to see how stories can actually interest people as well.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you go about, Fiona, writing a story? Do you have a certain, is there kind of a script or checklist that you follow when you write a story? How does that look?
Now that's a really good question. And that came out of something we were doing. We were on a camping trip, and I always have time to think at camping trips about what the year ahead looks like.
Yeah.
And so I came up with this idea called Plan to Publish. And this was part of the idea of getting people to get it out.
Mhm.
And so I set out 12 steps to getting a story actually written and published by the end of the year.
Mhm.
And the idea was that if you could first of all do a bit of a plan, then do a bit of a structure, and that could be downloading something from your family history program, etc.
Yeah.
The writing part of it is just one step.
Right.
And I know for me that that's not my favorite step. I'm not a natural writer.
Yeah.
School for me was maths and accounting and that sort of thing. English was not my favorite topic. So I understand that for lots of people, that's not their favorite part.
Yeah.
And so part of it is just the idea of, well, look, let's look at what you've got already. You've done all this research. You've got all these sort of stages in life and dates and what happened. Let's start by just putting them in as bullet points.
Yeah.
Because if you can start with bullet points, you've got a bit of a structure. And then each of those bullet points can then be written into a sentence.
Yeah.
And once you've got a sentence, it's amazing how quickly 5 or 6 sentences suddenly become 100 words. And if you do something like a photo book or something quite short that has lots of photos and just needs a little bit of text, all of a sudden you've got a book.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't matter if you write 5 words, 100 words, 1,000 words. If you've shared something, that's fantastic.
Yeah. I agree. I think that people just don't, they have that, stigma of getting started. And you're right. I think it doesn't matter how many words it is, as long as you get something down. I think that's so important. I want to kind of ask this question to kind of piggyback off that. So I love the 12 steps. Do you have that on your site, or is that somewhere that people can access it?
Sure do. There's a webinar that I gave a couple of years ago about the program, and then there's actually 12 guides that are sitting there, and they're all actually free on my
Okay.
website, so you can
Awesome.
download them all.
Awesome. I will make sure to link that when we do the
Fantastic.
yeah, that'd be awesome. Talk about how to tie to this. Do you use historical records to tell your stories?
Absolutely. They form part of that backbone, part of that structure, part of that skeleton of the story. We only have a limited amount of photos. In my family, we seem to have very few photos in those early years. And I know there's some ancestors I have no photos of at all, even though photography was a thing at the time.
Right.
So you're always going to be adding historical records in there. Now, in New Zealand, we have a fantastic collection of newspapers through a website called Papers Past that are digitized and are freely available.
Okay.
Australia has an equivalent site called Trove, which has the Australian newspapers on them. They add so much in social history to
Mhm.
what we can find out.
Yeah.
So for example, for me, probably the thing that I wasn't expecting to find out was looking in these newspapers and finding out that my great-great-grandmother was a bigamist. But we find out these things and it's like, okay, where is that going to lead me to? And
Yeah.
so the historical documents give you a moment in time.
Mhm.
They're not the whole story.
Yeah.
They're the night of the census, these people were living in the house. But we need to sort of apply what happens to us as well. I know that on one of our New Zealand censuses, we were house sitting for someone. So we weren't at home. And in fact, this was just before we went off on our big OE.
Yes.
So we were in a different place. Just
Mhm.
because these people are all living there on the night of the census doesn't mean that every night they lived there. So you need to be aware of how the historical documents work. But they give you a picture, they give you something to bounce off, they give you something to write about, they give you something to link to, and they may give you the illustration that you need to put in your book as
Yeah.
well.
Tell me how you go about, talking about your grandmother. We all have those stories. We have the things that we don't necessarily want to talk about, and
Mhm.
how important do you think that is to add that anyway?
Yeah, the hard things are an interesting thing to actually write about.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting, and I've had this conversation with a few people lately, is it's often distance and time that makes it easier to write about. My great grandmother, I didn't know her.
Yeah.
So I don't have that personal connection going, oh, that's really hard.
Mhm.
Um, Whereas if it was finding out that my mother was a bigamist,
Right.
that would be quite a different thing.
Right.
So distance helps you to write about harder things to start off with.
Yeah.
When they're closer, sometimes we're too emotionally attached to it still,
Yeah.
that it can be too hard to write about. And maybe it's not for us to actually write about and put it out there.
Right.
Maybe it's for our grandchildren to come and look at from the bigger picture.
Right.
And that goes with history as a whole. There are
Mhm.
things that were hard in the past that our ancestors did because that was the norm
Right.
rather than necessarily by choice.
Yeah.
And so we have to understand that in their time and in their situation, this is what happened.
Mhm.
And it's the same when I'm now working with people that are looking for birth parents.
Yes.
It's really interesting when you look through time and you go, okay, in the 1950s and 1960s in New Zealand, being a single mother was not acceptable.
Mhm.
It just wasn't something that could happen.
Yeah.
And so a lot of women were forced to give up their children.
Yeah.
They had no choice. This is what had to happen.
Mhm.
Yet you go back a couple of generations, and I know that both of my sets of great grandparents adopted in or had the child that was the oldest daughter's child. They brought up as the next sibling, as the youngest
Yes.
sibling,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
that was just acceptable.
Right.
And so it's interesting to see that change over time as well, because that, as you say, has a bearing on those difficult stories.
Yeah.
They were difficult at a time, but they weren't necessarily difficult in the future. It'll be normal in the future.
Right.
So yeah, it is hard to talk about. Um, there are some things that I've done, like for example, my grandmother had a stroke when I was quite young.
Mhm.
I grew up with her living in the house with us.
Mhm.
She was fabulous, even though she couldn't speak to us properly. So I still have, for example, there might be a small hoarding thing happening in the background here. I still have the caliper that she used to wear around her leg and in her shoe. I don't know how I've still got this actually, but I
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
And, part of my daily routine was helping my nana put her shoes on every day, helping her get dressed, helping, this was just the norm. Now, my children will never understand that, and they won't understand what that caliper means. And
Right.
it'll probably get chucked out at the first opportunity, let's face it.
Right.
So for me, writing the story about my nana and her stroke and what that caliper means to me,
Sure.
I can use that to illustrate.
That's
So we can use strange things to illustrate our stories that have a historical and maybe not a happy thing as well.
right. Those were great examples. Great. I love great conversation. Those were all very good. Love those. Do you have any tools, Fiona, or resources aside from your 12 steps for writing that you suggest for people when they're starting their, either their research into family history or writing the family history? Are there any other tools or resources that you suggest?
It's always good to contact people. Start a family group.
Yeah.
Start a family group is fantastic for getting people talking about things. We have a family group. You can send photos to it of strange things. Like my brother, for example, was at a secondhand shop and he's like, is this the radio that, Nana and Granddad used to have in their kitchen?
Yeah.
So that started a conversation and that gets you going looking for photos that show the radio.
Yes.
So having some sort of family group that gets everyone talking is a really good tool to have within your family. Wider is just to look at sort of questions that you can perhaps get started with. I know I've got a recording memories talk that was on Roots Tech a couple of years ago. And so that's got some resources with some questions in it just to start the conversation, because that can be useful to throw in there and just get people going.
Yeah.
But then just to start how you want to structure things, I guess. Think about that plan, think about how it's going to come together, think about who your audience is. Who are you actually writing for? Writing children's books versions of the family stories can actually be a nice way to get them out.
Yes.
And then you can go and start looking for fun illustrations of things. Maybe not people getting killed by trees, but it's amazing what that can do for just getting a story out as well.
Yeah, agreed. What do you do when you don't have a picture or a record of some kind to go with something, but you have that story? You know what I mean? Like you've got that story, but you don't necessarily have something to go with it. Do you just not worry about it, or do you add something different?
Sure. A couple of things. Sometimes there'll be some sort of historic document.
Mhm.
Sometimes you may just want to get a picture of the place
Yeah.
or a map. Maps can be really good because they can help people orientate them, because especially when we're doing research for so long, we know where these places are and how they relate and how far apart they are and all of that. But not everyone has that knowledge. So maps can be really good. I have to admit, I've just started playing with AI. So we were talking earlier about the Memories in Time project and the
Mhm.
finding of items.
Yes.
And one of the items that I've found is a marriage certificate. It's for a gentleman called McGregor Wright, and he was born in Scotland and came to New Zealand. And he works as a picture framer and gilder. And so I must admit, I went on AI and said, can you show me what a picture framer and gilder would have looked like in the 1860s in Scotland?
I love that.
And it's actually come up with quite a nice image that I can actually use. So as long as I'm clear that this is AI generated,
Right.
and that's a big thing for me, is that we have to be clear about what we're changing.
Yes.
I'm happy to use that as an illustration, because it's no different to someone illustrating a book as such, to illustrate this part of the story
Yes.
with the knowledge that it may not be 100% accurate.
Right. Right.
So you can do a little bit like that as well. Churches, inside of churches, go to historical museums and see what you can find in the museums, because maybe they've got items that can be photographed and added to your stories. Just look around and see. And it may be the strangest thing. It may be that part of this is says that these people were living in the pub at this census time. Well, okay, is there anything about pubs at that time that will then lead to an illustration? Can you find anything if you do a deep dive into the internet to find something else to illustrate it? And
Great. Great.
again, talk to your family, because maybe someone else has something.
Yeah. Right. I love those are great ideas to share with our audience. And I think too that you really hit the nail on the head with the we're so familiar with it and we're so invested in everything that it just seems, commonplace to us, an address or, a home site. And that's not always the case with the people that are our audience. So
Mm.
that was a great tip.
Yeah, the other one to add in there is, where are all the graves and things like that? We know where they are. We know who's buried in that particular cemetery and roughly where they might be, but making sure that the rest of the family actually know
Yes.
who's where, what, how, etc.
Do you have, I don't know the answer to this question. Do you guys have, like we have over here, Find a Grave? Do you guys have Find
Mhm.
a Grave or something similar to
Yeah,
it?
find a
Yeah.
grave and billions graves. are over here as well. But we're also lucky in New Zealand because the New Zealand Society of Genealogists, right from almost when they started in the 1960s, started an incredible project of transcribing basically every cemetery in New Zealand.
Oh, wow.
And so they did that right through the 70s and 80s. And so that incredible resource is available on Ancestry.
Yes.
It has some burial records as well as just straight transcriptions. But we're also lucky that most of our city councils or regional councils also have a lot of online databases that have the modern stuff on them as well, the modern records.
Nice.
So finding graves, we're usually pretty good at.
Yes.
There may not be a marker on that grave any longer,
Yes.
but and I keep having to remind people that wooden crosses got put on graves.
Yes.
Wooden crosses do not last 150 years.
Right.
So there may well have been a marker, it's just not there any longer. So yeah, we've got some fantastic resources like that are available.
Awesome. This is always my favorite part. So I have to ask, can you share a, particular family story, a favorite family story that you have with our audience? Oh, this is always my favorite.
Sure. One thing I think partly because we live in New Zealand, we're on an island. We're at the bottom of the southern hemisphere. We know pretty much that all our ancestors got here somehow.
Mhm.
So one book that I'm working on at the moment is about the immigrant ancestors. Who were they? How many were there? And there's even, I might be one person, but I think I've got something like 20 immigrant ancestors
Mhm.
that actually immigrated to New Zealand
Wow.
to make me now. So immigration has always been really special to me. I found out years ago that my great whatever grandmother, whose name is Jane Hannam, her maiden name was Berkey, she immigrated to New Zealand in 1872. And she immigrated to join her son who was already out here, who was actually my ancestor. So he had come out in the 1850s via Australia and ended up in the west coast of New Zealand. Several of his siblings followed on, and then eventually Jane and the youngest daughter came out last in 1872. And they came on a ship called the Euterpe. And there's a couple of parts to the story. The first part is I'm in an archive one day, and I must have been looking up the shipping records even, I think, and there was another researcher there. And she said, "Did you say the Euterpe?" And I said, "Oh, yes, I did." And she goes, "Oh, I know all about that because my ancestors came on a different voyage, but the same ship."
Wow.
So once I got home, she sent me a whole envelope of documents and information about the ship. But what was the best part of this, and I'm getting goosebumps as I'm saying this.
Me too.
What was the best part of this was she said, "Did you know the Euterpe still exists?" And I'm like, "Really?" She goes, "Yes." So the Euterpe got renamed as the Star of India. And the Star of India sits in the harbor in San Diego. So when we came back from our big UK trip and we came back through the USA, one thing we did is we went to San Diego and I got to stand on the ship, the Star of India, which was the ship my ancestor actually lived on, slept on, and as it turned out, was the matron on because she was the eldest of the single woman on the ship. And because she was the matron, she got free passage out to New Zealand.
You have brought tears to my eyes. That's incredible. That is
Yeah.
amazing. Wow.
It's so to actually stand there on the ship and feel it
Yeah.
on, even though it's docked and but you're on the water and you're seeing what a cabin actually looks like and how small the beds are
Yes.
and how little space they had. And they were on these ships for about 3 months coming out to New
Oh
Zealand.
my goodness. Wow.
And it's not an easy trip because they come down basically through the Atlantic and around South Africa and along between basically Antarctica and Australia and what we call the Roaring Forties to get through there. So they get all the extremes of temperature from what you get at the equator right down to what you get in the southern hemisphere.
Wow.
So
That
it
that
wasn't a safe trip, and as you can imagine, conditions weren't necessarily great. Reading some of the shipboard diaries of other voyages, you find out that they had storms for days on end where everything is wet.
Mm,
They're in the bowels of the ship. They don't know really what's happening. The water's sloshing over them. If you stand up, you get knocked around. Yeah, that was pretty hard life.
yes,
And so when you get to us now and, and we're having this pretty cushy life, really, you
yes,
go, actually, look what they did to get us here. And that sort of can be quite humbling.
yes. That is a great story. Wow, amazing. Well, as we finish up here, Fiona, what would you say? Do you have any other tips, tricks, or advice, wisdom that you would like to leave with our audience about storytelling, family history in general? Anything you want.
I think the biggest thing is just start. Get it out of the computer, get it into the hands of the people. You've been doing all this research. You've been doing it because you think it's important. I worry about the future. I worry in particular if you think into the genealogist in the future, what they are going to find out about our time. One of my most treasured collections is a set of letters that I have that my ancestors wrote. Nobody writes letters any longer. Nobody sends cards. We don't write diaries because we're putting it all on social media. All our messaging is electronic. We don't print these things out. All our photos are taken digitally, and a good percentage of us don't print those out either. So make sure you're getting it out of the computers and into the hands, because the genealogists and the family historians and our descendants in the future aren't going to have the treasures that we treasure now available to them.
Right.
So I still think that the best way of doing that is in some sort of printed format,
Yes.
because it's much more likely to last if it's actually printed in a book, in a document, in something out of your computer.
Yeah.
Not at the wiles of what computer companies might want to do, what social media companies might want to do, and just what our technology might want to break on us at some stage and not like to share.
Right. Yeah. Great.
So I think that's the biggest thing.
Yeah, great advice. Well, Fiona, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and passion with me today. I am just honored that you spent time with me today. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. It's been lovely. Thanks, Heather. Ngā mihi.
Until next time, friends, embrace the power of your family's untold tales and embark on a journey of discovery. Let the ink flow and the words dance as you weave together the threads of your ancestors' lives. Start writing your family's stories today and let their voices echo through the generations to come at storied.com. Have a great day. And that brings us to the end of this episode of the Family Treehouse, where we celebrate the power of storytelling and preserving our family legacies. Storied is more than just a platform for sharing stories. Dive into those historical records and newspapers, discovering the hidden gems that bring your ancestors to life. Add branches to your family tree, connecting the dots between generations. Thank you for joining us on this storytelling journey. Your stories matter, and through Storied, they have the power to resonate across time and touch the hearts of generations to come. Keep uncovering your family's history and keep the spirit of storytelling alive with Storied.